Namaskaram. Today I'm going to be talking about the 20th paragraph of Nāṉ Ār. This is the final paragraph. And as always, Bhagavan, when he concludes a work, his conclusion is very significant. So though this is a short paragraph, it is a very significant paragraph. It's very important what Bhagavan teaches us in this paragraph, because this is the conclusion of the whole work, Nāṉ Ār. This paragraph is just 4 sentences, but in these 4 sentences, Bhagavan says a lot. The first 2 sentences are tāṛndu, eṛundāl, sakalam-um, eṛum. That means if oneself rises, everything rises. Nāṉ aḍaṅgiṇāl, sakalam-um aḍaṅgum. If oneself subsides or ceases, everything subsides or ceases. This is one of the fundamental principles of Bhagavan's teachings. Here, oneself, by tāṛndu, which means oneself, he's referring to ego, because the self that rises is only ego. Our real nature neither rises nor subsides. It remains as it always is. But this ego rises. And when ego rises, everything rises. When ego doesn't rise, nothing rises. So to the extent to which we subside, everything subsides. To the extent that we rise, everything rises. This is one of the fundamental and extremely radical principles of Bhagavan's teachings. He expresses this very clearly and emphatically in verse 26 of Ulladu, in which he says, "Ahandayundayin anatumundahum." If ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. Ahandayindrail indru anatum. If ego does not exist, everything does not exist. Ahandeya yavamam. Ego itself is everything. Ādalal yadu idu endru nādale ovadal yavameno. Therefore, know that investigating what this is alone is giving up everything. What this is means what this here refers to ego. So investigating ego is giving up everything. Why is it giving up everything? Because the nature of ego, as Bhagavan explained in the previous verse 25 of Ulladu, the nature of ego is to rise, stand, and flourish by grasping form. That means by attending to things other than itself, by grasping in its awareness anything other than itself. By doing so, it rises, stands, and flourishes. Without grasping other things, ego cannot stand. So the very nature of ego is to grasp. And then what he says in verse 25 is, he describes at the end of a verse, he describes ego as uruvatrapayahande, the formless phantom ego. That is, ego is a formless phantom. It's formless because it's got no form of its own. And it's a phantom because it's got no substance of its own. It borrows its substance from Sat-Chit. So the seeming existence and seeming awareness of ego is borrowed from Sat-Chit. And it borrows its form from a body. So it is neither the substance nor is it the form. It is just a formless phantom. But how did this formless phantom come into existence? As Bhagavan says, he begins the verse by saying, Urupatri-undam, grasping form, it comes into existence. Urupatri-nikum, grasping form, it stands. Urupatri-undu mika-ongum, grasping and feeding on forms, it flourishes abundantly. Uruvittu urupatram, leaving form, it grasps form. So it cannot remain without grasping form. So if it lets go of one form, it grasps another form. In a dream, for example, we take the form of a body to be ourself. As soon as that dream comes to an end, if we don't fall, subside into sleep, if we come to another state, similar state, which we now call waking, but is actually just a dream, there also we grasp another form. So leaving one form, we grasp another form. So ego cannot rise, stand, or flourish without grasping forms. Therefore, Bhagavan says, Tedinal otam pidicum. If sought, it takes flight. That is, if ego, instead of trying to grasp anything else, if it tries to grasp itself, if it tries to attend only to itself, it will subside and dissolve back into its source. And that's why Bhagavan says it will take flight. To explain it in another way, we seem to be ego only so long as we are attending to things other than ourselves, only so long as we're aware of anything other than ourselves. Instead of attending to other things, if we try to attend to ourselves, we lose our hold on all forms, and therefore we subside and dissolve back into our source. That's why he says, if sought, it takes flight. That is, we seem to be ego only so long as we're looking out away from ourselves. If we look back at ourselves to see who am I, there's no such thing as ego to be found. Because what ego actually is just the pure awareness I am. Just like if you see a rope and mistake it to be a snake, the only way to get rid of a false knowledge that it's a snake is to look at it very carefully. If you look at it carefully enough, you'll see, oh, it's not a snake, it's just a rope. So there never was a snake there. Likewise, there never was any such thing as ego. But ego seems to exist so long as we don't look at ourselves keenly enough. So, that's why in the next verse, in verse 26, the first verse I referred to, he says, investigating what it is giving up everything. That is, to the extent to which we investigate ourselves, to that extent does ego subside. And since everything comes into existence only when ego comes into existence, and when ego doesn't exist, nothing else exists. When we investigate ego, ego will subside, and everything will subside along with it. That is why in this concluding paragraph of Nāṉ Ār, he begins with these two sentences: tāṛndu, sakalam-um. If oneself rises, everything rises. aḍaṅgiṇāl, sakalam-aḍaṅgum. If oneself subsides, everything subsides. The verb he uses here for rises is eṛum. Eṛum means, the verb eṛu means to rise, to ascend, to go up, to appear, to arise, to originate, to come into existence, to start. And it's got so many meanings: to grow, to increase. So to the extent to which we rise as ego, to that extent does everything else come into existence. And the verb he uses for subside is aḍaṅgu, which means to subside, to settle down, to cease, to disappear. So to the extent that ego appears, everything appears. To the extent the ego disappears, everything disappears. But it's not just a matter of appearance and disappearance. It also implies coming into existence and ceasing to exist. Because in verse 26, Bhagavan is very unequivocal about it. The verb he uses there, ahande undayin, uṇḍahu means to come into existence. So if ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. Ahande, if ego doesn't exist, y-irundālum, everything doesn't exist. So nothing exists independent of ego. This is one of the fundamental principles of Bhagavan's teachings. And why he emphasizes this so much is to help us to gain vairagya. That is, everything, all of this is just a dream, as Bhagavan often emphasized. None of it has any existence or reality independent of our perception of it. So what Bhagavan is saying in this last sentence, in these two sentences, the first two sentences of the last paragraph, is what he had implied in so many different ways in other parts of this work. For example, he began the third paragraph by saying, Sava arivikum, sava toricum, karanamahya, manam aḍaṅgiṇāl, jagadrishti ningam. He uses the same verb here, aḍaṅgu, which means to subside or cease. If the mind, which is the cause for all awareness and all activity, ceases, jagadrishti, that is perception of the world, will depart or will cease, it implies. What he means here by saying the cause for all awareness, what he means here by awareness is awareness of things other than ourselves. So we know what is the cause for the awareness of things other than oneself and for all activity, all action, for both for knowing and for doing. The cause is mind. If mind doesn't rise, or if the mind ceases to rise, if it subsides, the perception of the world, which is obviously a function of the mind, ceases. In this context, what he means by mind is ego, because as he clarified elsewhere, for example, in verse 18 of Upadesha, in verse 18 of Upadesha, he says, "Enangale manam," thoughts alone are the mind. What he implies thereby is that the term mind is often used as a collective name for the totality of all thoughts. So in its broadest sense, mind is all thoughts. But what he means by thoughts are all mental phenomena. He's not just talking about the mental chatter. He's talking about all mental phenomena, including perceptions, memories, likes, dislikes, everything, all are thoughts, and the totality of all thoughts is the mind. And then he goes on to say, this in verse 18 of Upadesha, Yavinum nāṇenum naṉmai-y-uṇḍu. Of all, the thought called I is the root. Mūlam means root, base, foundation, origin, source, or cause. So the cause or the base or the foundation or the root from which all other thoughts sprout is only from I. This thought called I. This thought called I, it's another term for ego. That's Bhagavan often used to refer to ego as the thought called I, because ego is itself a thought. But it's a thought unlike all other thoughts, because whereas all other thoughts are jada, this ego, the first thought I, is chit jada granti. It's a confused mixture of chit and jada. Chit here means chit means awareness. Chit is here referring to, chit jada granti refers to sat chit. Our fundamental awareness of our own existence, I am. That is chit. And jada refers to the body. So as ego, we are always aware of ourselves as I am this body. So this mixed awareness, I am this conflated awareness, this awareness in which the pure awareness I am is mixed and conflated with adjuncts such as this body. That is ego. So ego is chit jada granti. It's a knot formed by the entanglement of chit and jada. So whereas all other thoughts are jada, ego is the only thought that is endowed with awareness. So because ego is endowed with awareness, it is only in the view of ego that all other thoughts arise. So no other thought can exist independent of ego. So he said, Bhagavan says, of all the thoughts, the thought called I is the root. And he concludes the verse saying, what is called mind is I, implying that though the term mind is often used as in a broad sense to refer to all thoughts, what the mind essentially is just this first thought I, namely ego. So in this paragraph of Nāṉ Ār, in paragraph 3, when he says, if the mind, which is the cause for all awareness and all activity, ceases or subsides, jagat drishti will depart. by mind here, he means ego, because ego is the all other thoughts are perceived, are things perceived by ego, whereas ego is the perceiver. So the ego is the cause for all awareness and all activity, because it's only in the view of ego that awareness of other things arises, and that consequently all activities, actions of mind, speech, and body, they all arise only in the view of ego. When we don't arise as ego in sleep, there is no awareness of anything other than ourselves, and there's no awareness of any activity. So that's why Bhagavan says in this sentence, if the mind, which is the cause for all awareness and for all activity, ceases, Jagat Drishti, perception of the world, will depart. So what Bhagavan is saying here, what Bhagavan implies here is what he says explicitly in the first two sentences of this last paragraph. If oneself rises, everything rises. If oneself subsides, everything, or if oneself ceases, everything ceases. So all other things exist only in the view of ego. That is the implication. Likewise, in the fourth paragraph, he begins by saying, again, he's using the term mind here, but he's using the term mind. Generally, when he uses the term mind, he's using it to refer to ego. So in most cases here where he's using the term mind, he's referring to ego, the perceiving element of the mind, the subject as opposed to the objects. That is, ego is the subject, all other thoughts are objects. So he begins by saying what is called mind is a wonderful power, an Adisaya Shakti, that exists in Atma-swarupa, in our own real nature. And then he says, Adu sakala ninevukaleum totruvikindradu. It causes all thoughts to appear. So mind is the cause for the arising of all thoughts, because all thoughts appear only in its view. And he then, in the next sentence, he says, Ninevukale elam niki pakindra podu taniyai manam endro porolile. If we remove all thoughts, that implies including the first thought I, there is no such thing as mind. So the mind is nothing but thought. Ahayal nineve manatin sarupam. Therefore, thought alone is the nature of the mind. And then he goes on to say, Ninevukale tavitu jagamendro porol naṉmai-y-uṇḍu. That means excluding thoughts, there's nothing separately as world. So what he implies here is that the world is nothing but thoughts. So when Bhagavan talks about thoughts, all phenomena, he implies that all phenomena are thoughts. Why does he say the world is nothing but thoughts? Because just like in dream we see a world, but that world is just our own mental fabrication. It doesn't actually exist. When we don't see it, it doesn't exist. So it's a mental fabrication. So just like the world we see in a dream consists of nothing but thoughts, the world we see now consists of nothing but thoughts. That is Bhagavan's decided conclusion. He's very emphatically, he emphasized that in so many ways. And then he goes on to say, Tukatil ninevugale illai jagamum. In sleep, there are no thoughts, there is also no world. The implication is, but because there are no thoughts in sleep, therefore there's no world, because the world is nothing but thoughts. That's the implication. Jagra swapnangalil, in waking and dream, ninevugal ulla, thoughts exist, jagamum uṇḍu. And there is also the world. So whenever there are thoughts, there's a world. Whenever there are no thoughts, there's no world, because the world is nothing but thoughts. And then he gives the analogy of the spider. He says, just as a spider spins out thread from within itself and again draws it back into itself, so the mind makes the world appear from within itself and again dissolves it back into itself. This analogy of the spider spinning out the thread and drawing it back within, sometimes this is mistranslated as it spins out the web. This isn't referring to the web. This is what is referred to in this analogy, I think, is what is called a gossamer, which is the thread from which the spider hangs. So the spider will emit that thread and hang from it, and then when it wants to go upwards again, it draws that thread back into itself. That is what is referred to here. So a spider has that ability to eject a thread and hang on and use it to hang on, and then to draw it back into itself and thereby go up again. That is the implication here. So this analogy is given in one of the Upanishads, but people generally take it to mean that it's Brahman that projects the world and draws it back into itself. But here Bhagavan very clearly says it is the mind that makes the world appear from within itself and again draws it back into itself. So is Bhagavan here contradicting what is said in the Upanishads? No, he's clarifying what is said in the Upanishads. Brahman as Brahman doesn't make anything appear, doesn't project anything. Brahman, nature of Brahman is mere being. It's only, but what is Brahman? Brahman is nothing but ourself. We ourselves are Brahman. When we rise as ego, it's only as ego or as mind, but we project all these things. So it is not Brahman as Brahman that projects the world. It's Brahman as mind that projects the world. That is what Bhagavan is clarifying here. So there's so many things in very, very simple sentences. Bhagavan is actually giving very radical teachings, and also he's clarifying things about which there had been so much confusion in the past. Bhagavan makes it clear it is only the mind that projects the world. That's why he says, the reason I'm referring to all these things is what Bhagavan says in this final paragraph is summarizing what he said in so many other places. So this is why he says in this final paragraph, if oneself rises, that means if ego or mind, if we rise as ego or mind, everything rises. If oneself subsides, everything subsides. So because everything exists only in the view of ourself as ego or mind. And then, so coming back to this fourth paragraph where he gave that analogy of the spider, he says, after giving that analogy, he goes on to say, Manam Atma Sarupa Tinindru Velipadam Podu Jagam Tondrum. When the mind comes out from Atma Sarupa, the world appears. What's he mean by when the mind comes out? Obviously, we shouldn't take this literally, because Atma Sarupa, our own real nature, is the infinite whole. So the mind can never come out of Atma Sarupa. As he said in the first sentence, the mind is a wonderful power that exists in Atma Sarupa. So it never actually comes out of Atma Sarupa. What he means by if it comes out of, it's a metaphorical way of saying if it rises. Because when we rise as mind, we seemingly forsake our real identity, which is just pure awareness, that is Atma Sarupa, and we seem to become something else. So it's as if the mind is coming out from Atma Sarupa. It's not literally coming out. So when we rise as mind, when we separate ourselves from Atma Sarupa, or seemingly separate ourselves from Atma Sarupa, the world appears. And then he concludes, Ahayal Sarupam Tondrum Podu, Ahayal Jagam Tondrum Podu Sarupam Tondradu. Therefore, when the world appears, our real nature does not appear. Sarupam tāṛndu, and then he clarifies what he means by tāṛndu. Tāṛndu means to appear. He clarifies it as prakāsikam. That means to shine. So sarupam tāṛndu prakāsikam podu jagam tāṛndradu. When our real nature appears or shines, the world does not appear. Our real nature is ever shining, but it's always shining as I am. But when we rise as ego, as mind, instead of being aware of ourselves as just I am, we're aware of ourselves as I am this person, I am Michael, I am this body. So when we limit ourselves, when we rise as ego, we thereby limit ourselves, and it's only when we limit ourselves as a form of a body that a world appears. So whenever a world appears, we're aware of ourselves as a person within that world. So we are not aware of ourselves as we actually are. When we're aware of ourselves as we actually are, we cannot mistake ourselves to be a person, and therefore no world appears. So this again is saying, it's saying this, what he implies in this final paragraph, that if oneself appears, everything appears. If oneself if oneself disappears, everything disappears. That is, if oneself comes into existence, everything comes into existence. If oneself does not come into or ceases to exist, everything ceases to exist. So he's emphasizing this in so many ways throughout Nāṉ Ār and other works. There's so many verses I can refer to in which Bhagavan is implying the same thing. So in this fourth paragraph, after saying that when the world appears, our real nature does not appear. When our real nature appears, the world does not appear. He then goes on to say a bit more about the nature of mind. Again, we have to understand what he means here by mind is ego, what the mind essentially is. He says, maṉattai, what he goes on, the next thing he goes on to say, maṉattai sarupate vicharite konde ponal tāne manamai mudiyam. This is a very, it's expressed in very cryptic language here. What he says is, if one goes on investigating the nature of the mind, oneself, literally it means oneself alone will end as mind. What it implies is that what now appears as mind will be, it's ourself that will be recognized. Like if you go on looking at this seeming snake, if you look at it carefully enough, you will see that it was a rope alone that was appearing as the mind. Likewise, if we investigate the mind keenly enough, we will see that what was appearing as the mind is actually nothing but ourself. It's ourself alone that was appearing as this mind. And then he clarifies what he means in this context by tāṛn. Tāṛn means oneself. It's the same word he uses in these first two sentences of the final paragraph. But in some contexts, like in this last paragraph, when he says if oneself rises, oneself there refers to ego. But in this context, he clarifies what he means by tāṛn in this context is tāṛn embadu Atma-vichara. Oneself, what is called oneself is only Atma-vichara. That is in this context. So if we go and investigate in the mind, we will finally see that what appeared as mind is only ourself, is only our real nature, what we actually are. And then he says, the mind stands, the mind exists. It implies the mind exists only by always going after something gross. This is, he's saying, what he says here is what he implies here is what he says in verse 25 of Ulladu, which is the mind cannot rise, stand, or flourish without grasping forms. Forms are anything other than itself is a form, and all other things, relative to ego, all other things are gross. So mind is always grasping some gross object or other. even the thoughts and the feelings and the perceptions and the memories, all these, all are relatively gross compared to ego, because they're all forms, whereas ego is just a formless phantom. So the ego cannot stand without grasping something gross, without grasping a form. Naṉmai-y-uṇḍu. Alone it cannot stand. That is, we cannot rise as ego without grasping something other than ourself, is the implication. Maṇattai sukshma sariram eṛrum jivan eṛum salupadikiradu. Mind alone is what is called the sukshma sarira, the subtle body, and jiva. Why does he, here what he means by mind is ego. So why does he say ego is itself subtle, the subtle body? Because generally in Vedanta, if you learn Vedanta according to the standard textbook, sukshma sarira means the pranamaya kosha, manamaya kosha, and vijnanamaya kosha. But here Bhagavan is saying it, the mind itself, the ego itself is called, as I say, here by mind he's referring to ego, the jiva. He's saying that itself is sukshma sarira. The reason he says this, and he also says, implies the same in verse 24 of Uludunapadu, is that it is generally said in the books, but when the gross body dies, it's the subtle body that transmigrates to other bodies. But what Bhagavan says here, actually that subtle body that goes from one body to another body, or is said to go from one body to another body, is nothing but ego. It is ego that is, but of course, is not literally a matter of leaving one body and going to another body, because as Bhagavan clarified, whatever we experience, any state of that we experience in which we're aware of phenomena is just a dream. So any body that we experience as ourself is just a dream body. So it's just a mental fabrication. So as soon as we rise as ego, we project a body and take it to be ourself. So what goes from one body to another body is only this ego. And what ego takes along with it when it goes, it takes its vasanas. That's why the vasanas collectively are called karana sarira, the causal body, because they are the seeds but sprout as all the other sheaves. So, but essentially, what is going from life to life, from one life to the next, it is ego and its vasanas. And of course, its karmas come along with it, but they are all in the hands of God, not in the hands of ego. The fruit of our past karmas are all safely in God's hands for him to do with it as he sees fit, what is best for us. And then in the next paragraph, Bhagavan goes on to imply the same thing. That is in the fifth paragraph, he again clarifies what he means by mind. He begins by saying, in the dehatil nan endru kalambavadu eduvo akte manamam. That means whatever it is that rises in this body as I, that alone is mind, the mind. So here he's very clearly emphasizing what he means by mind in this context is ego, because what is it that rises as I? It is ego only. So, so when he's using the term mind in this context, he's referring to ego. And why does he say it rises in the body? Because ego never rises without being aware of itself as I in this body. So metaphorically speaking, ego rises in this body. Of course, the body doesn't exist until ego rises, but as soon as ego rises, it projects and is aware of itself as I am this body. And then he goes on to say, if one investigates in what place the thought called I first rises in the body, one will come to know that it is in the heart. Some people misinterpret this sentence, saying, oh, Bhagavan's asking us to investigate what place in the body ego rises. That is not what Bhagavan means. when he talks about the ego, the place from which I rises, the place from which I rises is only our own real nature. That is, what is it that exists in the absence of ego is only our own real nature, pure awareness. So the place from which ego rises is only pure awareness, that fundamental awareness I am. But it rises in a body. That is, as soon as it rises, it projects a body and it's aware of itself. So when he says, one will come to know that it is the heart here doesn't refer to a place in the body. It's referring to that, what is the center of everything? That is the fundamental awareness I am. And then he says, that alone is the birthplace of the mind. Again, he's using birthplace in a metaphorical sense. So that fundamental awareness I am, which is called the heart, is the birthplace of the mind. That is the source from which mind appears. And then he gives a very nice practical clue. Even if one continues thinking, I, it will take and leave one in that place. This is a nice clue that Bhagavan gives us. This is particularly helpful for people when they start on the practice of self-investigation, because when we are investigating ourselves, we are not investigating any object, we're investigating the subject. So we're so used to attending to objects, which are all relatively gross. When we're asked to attend to ourselves, the subject, that's something altogether more subtle. So people get confused. How can I attend to myself? What is myself? They are in a confusion about what is meant. All it means is we have to attend to that fundamental awareness I am. But people are still looking for an object. Obviously, we ourselves are not an object. So when we are attending to ourselves, when we are being self-attentive, we're not attending to any object. We're attending only to our mere being, to our fundamental awareness of our own existence. I am. That is what we're attending to. So as an aid, Bhagavan said, even as you go on thinking I, why? If we go on thinking I, it will be drawing our attention back to ourselves. Because to what does the word I refer? It only refers to ourselves. So when we shouldn't be just meditating on the word I. It's what does the word I refer to? That's what we should be trying to investigate. So thinking I can be an aid in the early stages. But then what I really wanted to talk about in this paragraph, because this is the most important part and what is most directly relevant to these first two sentences of the final paragraph, Bhagavan says, of all the thoughts that appear or arise in the mind, the thought called I alone is the first thought. As I say, whenever Bhagavan talks about the thought called I, or the I thought, in Tamil, it literally means nāṇ ār niṇaivu. It means the thought called I. When the equivalent Sanskrit term is aham vritti, which means the I thought. But it means the same. But in either case, Bhagavan's referring only to ego. So of all the thoughts that appear in the mind, the thought called I alone is the first thought. The term he uses here for first thought is mudal niṇaivu. Mudal means first, primal, basic, original, or causal thought. So the first thought and the cause of all other thoughts is this thought called I. So what Bhagavan says in this sentence is the same as he said as he says in verse 18 of Upadesha, which I referred to earlier, where he says, thoughts alone are the mind, of all, meaning of all thoughts, the thought called I alone is the mūlam, the root, or the fundamental thought, the original thought. And therefore mind is only that, what mind essentially is only that thought called I. So he said the same thing here. Of all the thoughts that appear or arise in the mind, the thought called I alone is the first thought. Idu arinta pirahe enia ninevgul erukkindrana. Only after this appears, or this arises, do all other thoughts arise. This is exactly what he's saying in this final paragraph. If oneself arises, oneself here means ego, the thought called I. If oneself arises, everything rises. If oneself does not arise, if oneself ceases, everything ceases. So he's implying the same thing here. Because here he's talking about other thoughts. But as he said in the previous paragraph, paragraph 4, the world is nothing but thoughts. So when he says all other thoughts, that includes the world. All phenomena are included in the term other thoughts. So only after this first thought, I, namely ego, rises, do all other thoughts rise. In other words, only after ego rises, all phenomena rises. Only after the subject arises, do objects arise. There cannot be any objects without a subject. The subject is ego, all other thoughts are objects. And then in the final 2 sentences, he says the same thing using different terms. In the last 2 sentences, he refers to ego, the primal thought called I. He refers to it as the first person. The first person means I. And all other thoughts he refers to as second and third persons. Here people take the term person literally. In grammar, when these terms are borrowed from grammar. In grammar, we talk about first person, second person, third person. The first person is I. Second person is you. Third person is he, she, it, or they. So, but here Bhagavan isn't talking about grammar. Even in grammar, when we talk about these 3 persons, the third person includes insentient objects, but it includes it. So it's not. This is not talking about person. This is not talking about persons literally. This is a grammatical term, and actually in Tamil, they don't call these the 3 persons. They call them the 3 places. The first person is called naṉmai, which means selfness, or sometimes it's called naṉmai-y-uṇḍu, the selfness place. Second person is called munnilai, or munnilai-idam. Munnilai means what stands in front, or munnilai-idam means the place that stands in front. And padake means what spreads out, so all other things. So here Bhagavan isn't talking about persons. He isn't also talking about grammar. He's using these terms in a philosophical sense. In philosophy, first person means I, ego. Second and third persons is everything else, everything other than I. So the thought called I is the first person. All other thoughts are second and third persons. In other words, they're objects. The subject is the first person. Objects are second and third persons is another way of putting it. So only after the first person appears do second and third persons appear. Again, this is exactly what he's saying in this final paragraph. If oneself appears, everything appears. If oneself does not appear, if oneself ceases, everything ceases. So he's saying the same here. Only after the first person appears do second and third persons appear. And then he concludes by saying, Tanmay-indri munile padake gal ira. If without the first person, second and third persons do not exist. So without ego, nothing else exists. So if ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. If ego doesn't exist, everything doesn't exist. As he says in verse 26 of Uludunaptu, or as he says in this final paragraph, if oneself appears or comes into existence, or rises or comes into existence, everything rises or comes into existence. If oneself ceases, everything ceases. So why I've been going over these, I'm just pointing out how Bhagavan is, in this final paragraph, he is summarizing and also clarifying what he said in the previous paragraphs. For example, in the 3rd paragraph, when he says that if the mind, which is the cause for all awareness and all activity, awareness meaning awareness of other things, ceases, Jagat Drishti, perception of the world, will depart. People could interpret this if they wanted to. Yes, we know about the world, we perceive the world, and we perceive activities only when we rise as ego. But of course, the world exists there when we don't rise as ego. They could interpret it like that. That is not what Bhagavan means, as he makes clear in this final paragraph. If oneself comes into existence, everything comes into existence. If oneself ceases to exist, everything ceases to exist. So nothing has any, it's not only that things appear when we rise as ego, they come into existence. They do not exist at all when we are not aware of them. This is what is called drishti shrishti vada. That is, there's no such thing as creation, shrishti, independent of perception. That is, it's only in the perception of ego that all this seems to have been created. All this seems to exist only in the view of ourself as ego. So throughout, in so many places in Nāṉ Ār, Bhagavan is emphasizing, but everything else depends only on ego. Nothing exists independent of ego, is the implication. And this is also clearly implied by him, though he doesn't state it explicitly, it's the very obvious implication of paragraph 18, in which he says, besides the saying that waking is long-lasting and dream is momentary, there is no other difference, implying no other difference between them. And as I pointed out last month when I talked about this paragraph, in Guru-vācaka-kavai, Bhagavan says even this, even to say, besides the saying that waking is long and dream is short, Bhagavan said that's all only from the perspective of the mind in waking. So long as we're dreaming seems to be a long state, because in dream we have memories going back to our childhood. So how can you say this is a momentary? This has been going on. I've been living in this world for 60 years. That's how it seems to us so long as we're dreaming. Only when we wake up do we say, oh, that was just a dream. It was all just only momentary. So duration of time is relative. What seems to be long from one perspective seems to be short from another perspective. So Bhagavan's decided conclusion is there's no difference between waking and dream whatsoever. There may be some minor qualitative differences, but they are not significant. Substantially or substantively, what this waking state is nothing but a dream. It's nothing but a mental fabrication. So by emphasizing this, Bhagavan is emphasizing that just like the dream world, we all are ready to acknowledge that the dream world doesn't exist when we don't perceive it. When we wake up from a dream, we don't wonder what's happened to all our friends and relatives we left behind in the dream, whether they're managing okay, whether they're getting on okay without us. We don't think that at all, because we know it was all just a mental fabrication. According to Bhagavan, this waking state is equally just a mental fabrication, because none of this exists except when we see it. Only when oneself arises does everything else arise. And when oneself ceases to exist, everything else ceases to exist. So everything exists only in the view of ourselves. I've referred quite a number of places in Nāṉ Ār where Bhagavan implies what he states explicitly in these first two sentences of the last paragraph. I also referred to verse 26 of Uludunapadu, where he implies the same. I could point out many other verses. There are so many verses in Uludunapadu where Bhagavan is emphasizing the same thing. He's expressing it in different ways, but what he's emphasizing is the same. For example, in the fourth verse, he says, if oneself is a form, the world and God will be likewise. If oneself is not a form, who can see their forms and how? If oneself is a form, here implies if we rise as ego, because it's only when we rise as ego, but we take ourselves to be a form, namely the form of a body, a form of 5 sheaths. So it's only when we rise as ego and consequently experience ourselves as this body but there seem to be so many names and forms, and the world seems to be a mass of names and forms, and God also seems to be a name and form. Because so long as we experience ourselves as a form, we may say, oh, I believe in a formless God. But even our idea of a formless God is just a mental form. It's a mental concept. So it's also a form. We cannot know God as formless until we know ourselves as formless. When we know ourselves as formless, we will then know that there's no God other than ourselves, and that we are nothing other than God. It's only because we've limited ourselves as a form of a body that we seem to be something separate from God. When we no longer limit ourselves as a form, all forms are limited. Without a form, there are no limits, and therefore it's infinite. So God is infinite, we are infinite. We cannot be two different infinites. It's one and the same infinite. That is, if God is infinite, as religion generally will say, then logically, if God is infinite, nothing can be other than God. If something is other than God, then if you've got God and not God, then God is thereby limited. Because if there's something other than God, God isn't the infinite whole. So this is a big problem for theologians. So they try and complicate the matter and say he's infinite in this way and in this way, but not in this way. The theologians get themselves in a big mental twist. That is, they get themselves in a confusion. We have to be. Bhagavan was very explicit. God is infinite. Therefore, nothing is other than God. Therefore, we are nothing other than God. But so long as we limit ourselves as a form, we cannot but conceive of God as something limited. Because how can a limited mind conceive of something that is unlimited? So we conceive of God as a form. Even if our idea is God is formless, that idea God is formless is itself a mental form. So as he makes clear in that verse 4, it's only when we ourselves says only so long as we rise as ego and therefore take ourselves to be a form, do all other forms seem to exist. Does the world and God seem to be formed? When we don't rise as ego and therefore don't experience ourselves as a form, who is there to experience their forms? How can there be any experience of forms when we ourselves are not a form? So he clearly implies the same thing there. That everything, all forms, all phenomena depend upon our rising as ego. It's only in the view of ego that all forms seem to exist. And then in verse 5, he says, the body is a form composed of 5 sheaths. Therefore, all 5 are included in the term body. So when we talk about body, when Bhagavan uses the term body, when he says ego is nothing but the false awareness, I am this body, what he means by body is not just this physical body, but all the 5 sheaths. Because we never experience any of these 5 sheaths in isolation. When we experience one, we experience all of them. So when we experience ourselves as this body, the body seems to be, we never experience a dead body as I. Since it's a living body, there's the body and the life, naṇmai-y-uṇḍu and the pranamaya-kosha. And we never experience a sleeping body as I. It's always a body that seems to be awake. Even dream body seems to be awake so long as we're dreaming. So since it's awake, there's also the mind, the intellect, and the will. Maṇattai, vijñānamaya-kosha, and anandamaya-kosha. They're also functioning in it. So we never experience one without experiencing all 5. Therefore, Bhagavan says, therefore, eṛundāl, all 5 are included in the term body. And then he says, very importantly, uḍalandri ulahu-uṇḍu. Without a body, does any world exist? Is there a world? So here he's emphasizing the world does not exist independent of the body. And so it's only when we take ourselves as a body that there seems to be a world, is the implication. And then he says, uḍalvittu, leaving the body, ulhate kanda ularo. Does anyone exist who, leaving the body, is there anyone who has seen a world? So we cannot see a world except when we are aware of ourselves as a body. That's what he said in the previous verse, and he's also emphasizing it in this verse. So both of these verses imply only when we rise as ego does the world seem to exist. And then in the next verse, verse 6, he says very explicitly, Ulahu aim pulangol uru. The world is a form of 5 kinds of sense impression. That means sights, sounds, tactile sensation, tastes, and smells. These 5 kinds of sense impression constitute the world. So the world is the 5 kinds of sense impression, nothing else. That is, if you remove this, if you've got no sights, no sounds, no tactile sensations, no tastes or no smells, where is any world? The world is nothing but these 5 kinds. Otherwise, Bhagavan is implying the world is purely mental. And then he goes on to say, those 5 sense impressions are known, are impressions to the 5 sense organs. So it's the 5 sense organs that seems to receive these impressions. But then most importantly, he says, ulahei manam ondru aim porivayal or tidu talal maṉattai andri ulahu-uṇḍu. All right. That means, since the mind alone perceives the world by way of the 5 sense organs, is there a world besides the mind? That is not the sense organs that are perceiving the world. Sense organs are just the channel through which we seem to receive impressions from outside. But those who is it who experiences those impressions? It is only the mind. So since the mind alone perceives the world by way of the 5 sense organs, that this again is metaphorical, because Bhagavan, we think that we perceive the world through the 5 sense organs because we assume there's a world outside, but actually the world is nothing but these 5 kinds of sense impression. So it's when Bhagavan says by way of the 5 sense organs, what he means is, the implication is, since it's the mind alone that sees these 5 kinds of sense impressions that seem to be received through the 5 sense organs, is there a world besides the mind? Again, Bhagavan is emphasizing here, the mind is nothing but, the world is nothing but our perception of it. And since the perceiver is the mind here means ego, the perceiving element of the mind, the world obviously nothing can be perceived without a perceiver. So since the world is nothing but 5 kinds of sense impression, in other words, 5 kinds of sensory perception, 5 kinds of sense perceptions, there cannot be a world beside the mind. So Bhagavan is again emphasizing the same thing. In the 7th verse, he again emphasizes. Here he uses the word arivu, awareness, to refer to ego or mind, because he talks about awareness arising. The awareness that arises and subsides is not the real awareness, it's only mind or ego. So he says, though the world and awareness arise and subside simultaneously, the world shines by awareness. What that implies is, though as soon as we rise as ego, the world also appears. But though the world and ego arise and subside simultaneously, the world shines only by ego. Why? Because it's only in the view of ego that there seems to be a world. And then he goes on to say, only that which shines without appearing or disappearing at the place of the base of a ground for the appearing and disappearing of the world and awareness, again, awareness means ego, is the real substance, which is the whole. So here also Bhagavan is implying it's only when he says the world shines by awareness, he means the world shines only in the view of the mind, of the ego, that is. And then very importantly in verse 9 of Ulladu-napadu, Bhagavan says, irate muparigal eņgē oneself patri ullavam. That means dyads and triads exist always holding one thing. The dyads are, here means irritagal, it means pairs of opposites, what in Sanskrit are referred to as dvandvas. That is, pairs of opposites such as existence and non-existence, life and death, awareness and non-awareness, knowledge and ignorance, happiness and unhappiness, good and bad, liberation and bondage. All these pairs of opposites are dyads. And triads here means triputi. Triputi means whenever anything is known, there you have three things there. You've got a knower, you've got a means of knowing, and you've got the thing known. So all awareness or all knowledge of anything other than ourself entails these three. Ourself as the knower, the subject, namely ego. The means of knowing, there are so many different means of knowing. We know by sensory perception, seeing, hearing, tasting, and so on. We also know in so many other ways. We know by inferring things, by experiencing things, by believing reliable testimony. There are so many ways and means of knowing things. And there are also the things that we know. So these three, the knower, the means of knowing, and what is known, these are a triad. So these dyads and triads exist always holding one thing, Bhagavan says. Holding here implies depending upon. So what is that one thing that they all depend upon? Bhagavan doesn't state it explicitly here, but when he was asked, he clarified. The one thing referred to here is ego. Why is that? Because the pairs of opposites exist in whose view? Only in the view of ego. And ego is one of the three members of the triads, but it's the basic member because you cannot have nothing can be known without a means of knowing it. And without a knower, obviously. There cannot be any means of knowing without a knower. So both the means of knowing and whatever is known, both depend upon the knower. So since knower is ego, everything is depending on ego. Ego is that which knows the dyads and that which knows both, which by some means of knowing knows other things. By various means of knowing knows other things. So all these dyads and triads, they depend only on ego. So in the next sentence, he says, if one sees what within the mind, what that one thing is, they will slip off. Why is this? Because the dyads and triads are things experienced by us as ego. The one thing which that Bhagavan refers to here, as I say, is ego. So if we look within the mind to see who is this I in whose view dyads and triads seem to exist, this I, namely ego, will subside, because nature of ego is to rise, stand, and flourish by attending to things other than itself, but to subside to the extent to which it attends to itself. So when ego subsides, but how can dyads and triads remain in the absence of ego? because they exist only in its view. So when ego subsides, the dyads and triads will also slip off. And then he concludes, only those who have seen, implying those who have seen this, the cessation, the cessation of ego and all phenomena, are those who have seen the reality. See, they will not be confused. All confusion arises because we arise as ego and see all this multiplicity, and we get ourselves in a big confusion. When we don't rise as ego, there are no dyads and triads, and therefore no confusion whatsoever. So in this way, Bhagavan is emphasizing this in so many ways. In the next few verses, 10, 11, 12, 13, they're all talking about knowledge and ignorance. And he's emphasizing knowledge and ignorance both depend upon ego. It's only in the view of ego that there's knowledge and ignorance of anything else. And then in verse 14, as in that fifth paragraph of Nāṉ Ār, he talks about first person, second person, and third person. First person means ego, second and third person means everything else. So he says, if the first person exists, second and third persons will exist. In other words, if ego comes into existence, everything else comes into existence. If oneself rises, everything rises, as he says in this last paragraph. But then he goes on to say, if oneself investigating the reality of the first person ceases to exist. That is, if we investigate the reality of the first person, who am I? This first person, ego, will cease to exist, and second and third persons will also come to an end. And what will then remain shining as one, that alone is our real nature. That is what we actually are. So there are many other verses also in Ulladu where Bhagavan is implying the same thing. So why I mentioned or referred to so many different passages of his teaching to emphasize how important is this principle that he teaches us in these first two sentences of this last paragraph. That is, this is the essence of his teaching. If oneself rises, everything rises. If oneself subsides, everything subsides. Oneself here means ego. So if we rise as ego, everything else appears. If we don't rise as ego, nothing else exists whatsoever. So what do we infer from this? What is the aim of Bhagavan's teachings? It's nothing but the cessation of ego, because all problems, all good and bad, pleasure and pain, all suffering, everything, if we want to have pleasure, the price to be paid is pain. If you want to have good, the price to be paid is evil, because good and evil, you cannot have good without evil, and you cannot have evil without good, because these are all relative terms. So the good we are aiming for is that good, that the summum bonum, the ultimate good, the supreme good, is the good that is beyond both good and evil, good and bad. So we want to, it's only by going beyond the dyads and all the pairs of opposites that we can be free of all problems. That is, all duality exists only when we rise as ego. It doesn't actually exist, it seems to exist. So duality seems to exist when we rise as ego. So the whole aim of Bhagavan's teaching, Bhagavan has diagnosed what is the root problem. The root problem is our rising as ego. What is the solution to all problems? Don't rise as ego. So bringing about the cessation of the rising of ego is the sole aim of Bhagavan's teachings. That is what is implied here. And how to bring about the cessation of mind? He has emphasized in so many paragraphs of Nāṉ Ār. For example, in the 6th paragraph, he begins by saying, Nāṇa ennum vicharane inalaye manam aḍaṅgum. The mind will cease only by the investigation, who am I? What does he mean? Why? Here he emphasizes very, very strongly, that is, vicharane means by vichara. Vicharane means is emphasizing that, implying alone, but he puts a double emphasis. He says, vicharanayinā leye, a double emphasis he puts there. So he's emphasizing that it's only by means of vichara that the mind will subside. And likewise, in the first sentence of the 8th paragraph, manam aḍaṅgu vicharanaye tavira veratahunta upayangal illai. For the mind to cease, except vichara, that means self-investigation, there are no other adequate means. So he's emphasizing this so strongly. And like this in so many other places in Nāṉ Ār, in the 16th paragraph, he says, since every text, here text is referring to Advaita text, since in every text it is said that for attaining mukti, it is necessary to make the mind cease. After knowing that mano-nigraha, which in this context means cessation of mind, alone is the ultimate intention or purpose or aim of such texts, there's no benefit to be gained by studying texts without limit. For making the mind cease, it is necessary to investigate oneself to see who one actually is. That is, he says it very forcibly in Tamil. Maṉattai aḍaṅgum tannai ya endru vicharika vendamai alamal epidi nūlgalil vicharipadu. This is a sentence formation in Tamil, which is very difficult to, well, it cannot be, there's no equivalent sentence formation in English. So we have to slightly, what that sentence implies is, for making the mind cease, it is necessary for one to investigate oneself, to see who one actually is. And instead of doing so, how can we investigate and know ourselves in text? We cannot. The texts will all tell us that we are Brahman, but we cannot know Brahman merely by reading the text. In order to know Brahman, what is Brahman? You are that, tatvamasi. We ourselves are Brahman. So to know Brahman, we need to know ourselves. And how to know ourselves? We need to investigate ourselves. We cannot know what we actually are simply by reading books. As they say, there's an analogy they say, the almanac will tell you when it's going to rain. But however much you squeeze the pages of the almanac, you're not going to get a drop of water from them. Likewise, all the jnana sastras will tell us that we are Brahman, and that to know ourselves, that to know ourselves as Brahman, we need to investigate ourselves. But from those jnana sastras, we cannot get a drop of jnana. Jnana means the pure awareness. We need to experience ourselves as pure awareness. So we need to turn within. So the only way to, according to Bhagavan, the goal is to bring about the cessation of ego. As Bhagavan says in the final verse of Ulladu. What is mukti? Mukti is nothing but the destruction of ego. So that is the sole aim of Bhagavan's teachings. Why? Because only when we rise as ego does everything else come into existence. All problems arise because we've risen as ego. Therefore, bringing about the cessation of ego is the only solution to all problems. And we can bring about the cessation of ego only by investigating ourselves. Bhagavan also implies this very clearly in so many places in Ulladu. One example is in verse 27 of Ulladu. He says, Nānudiyāda ullanilai, nāmaduvai ullanilai. The state in which one exists without rising as I, or the state in which I exist without rising, is the state in which we exist as that. In other words, when the Upanishads say you are that, the state in which we can experience ourselves as that is the state in which we do not rise as ego. And then he says, Nān udikum tānum adai nādāmal Nān udiya tan irupai savadu evan. That means without investigating the place where I rises. What does he mean by the place where I rises? From where did this ego rise? Only from the real I, from what we actually are, our being I. That is the pure awareness I am. That is the place from which ego rises. So without investigating that, how to reach the annihilation of oneself in which I does not rise? So the implication is the only way to bring about the annihilation of ego, the only way to bring about the permanent cessation of the rising of ego is to investigate who am I, to investigate ourself, the source from which we've risen as I. And then he says, without reaching that state of annihilation, how to stand in the state of oneself in which oneself is that. So in order to experience ourselves as that, as Brahman, we need to cease rising as ego. And in order to cease rising as ego, we need to investigate ourselves. So Bhagavan is very, very emphatic in so many ways. But the goal is to not rise as ego, to bring about the permanent cessation of ego, the eradication of ego. Arunachala mena ahamainine pava ahatevera rupai arunachala. Bhagavan begins aksharam like his most heart-melting prayers. He begins by asserting this, but the ego can be eradicated only by meditating on Arunachala. And what is Arunachala? Arunachala ahame. Arunachala alone is I. That is, in that verse, he uses a word ahame, which has a double meaning. One meaning, the aham, there's a pure Tamil word, a word of Tamil origin, aham, which means inside, or means mind or heart. So ahame means in the heart. That's one meaning. Aham is also a Sanskrit pronoun, first person pronoun, meaning I, which is often used in Tamil. So the ahame there can mean in the heart. It can also mean only I. Taking the meaning only I, Murugan took the only portion to Arunachala and said, only Arunachala is I. Those who meditate that what shines in us as I is only Arunachala, you root out their ego. So the means to root out the ego is only to meditate on I, because I is the true form of Arunachala. That is a true form of Bhagavan. That is God, Guru, Self, everything. That is Brahman. So it's only by meditating on I that we can eradicate the ego. So Bhagavan, in so many ways, Bhagavan is emphasizing the same thing. So in order to bring about the cessation of ourselves, we need to investigate ourselves. Bhagavan doesn't say it explicitly in this final paragraph, but he said it so much before. That is what we have to understand. Our aim is to bring about the cessation of ego. We can bring about the cessation of ego only to the extent to which we investigate ourselves. Then the next sentence, the third sentence of this paragraph, sorry, I spent a very long time on the first two sentences, but it connects with so many other, it's a truth that Bhagavan emphasized in so many different ways in his works. In Arunachala also, he says, in verse 7, Indraha menu nene venipira vondrum, if the thought called I, that's ego, does not exist, nothing else exists. So Bhagavan is emphasizing it throughout his works, that everything depends for its semi-existence on the semi-existence of ourself as ego. So we need to put an end to our rising as ego. We can put an end to our rising as ego only by investigating ourselves. So in the third sentence is also a very, very important sentence. It's a sentence that is difficult to adequately translate in Tamil, in English. That is, he begins by saying evvaḷavukkevvaḷavu. Alavu means extent. Evvaḷavu means to what extent. So to what extent is evvaḷavukkevvaḷavu. To what extent, tāṛndu naḍakkiṟōmō, avvaļavukkavvaļavu, to that extent, naṉmai-y-uṇḍu. So what he's saying here, the tāṛndu naḍakkiṟōmō. Tāṛndu is an adverbial participle from the verb tār, which means to sink low or subside. It implies in this context being humble. So the more ego subsides, the more humble we will naturally be. So it doesn't literally mean humility, but it implies humility. And naḍakkiṛōmō means we walk, literally. It also means we behave or we conduct ourselves. So the implication is to the extent to which we conduct ourselves, to the extent to which sinking low we conduct ourselves. In other words, to the extent to which we subside and live accordingly in this world, avvaļavukkavvaļavu naṉmai-y-uṇḍu. To that extent and that extent alone is their goodness. So what is Bhagavan's definition of good? Bhagavan's definition of good is nothing but subsidence of ego. To the extent to which we sink low, to the extent to which we are truly humble, not just acting humble, but truly feeling ourselves to be the lowest of the lowest, the worst of the worst, that humility is alone true goodness. That is to the extent to which ego subsides, and ego will subside only to the extent to which we investigate ourselves. To that extent alone there is goodness. So Bhagavan often used to emphasize the importance of humility. Bhagavan even went so far in y-aḍakki-k-koṇḍirundāl. There's a verse in which Bhagavan, of course, the verses were composed by Murugan, but the ideas were Bhagavan. Murugan was recording what Bhagavan had said. Bhagavan said, what makes God worthy to be worshipped by all the worlds, by the gods in heaven and in all the different worlds? Why? How God is worthy to be worshipped by all the jivas in so many, and all the gods and divine beings and the suras, the demons, and everyone worships God. What makes God worship worthy of that worship? It is because of his humility, because God sees himself as lowest of the low. He considers himself lowest in his creation. It's because of that supreme humility that God is worthy to be worshipped. And Bhagavan's whole life was Bhagavan exemplified humility. Bhagavan's life was a shining example of complete humility. Bhagavan, for example, never claimed to be guru, because according to Bhagavan, so if you think I am guru, you are that is ego. To rise and say I am guru, that is ego. In the view of the real guru, there are no others. Since there are no others, there's no need for either guru or disciple. So the guru is necessary only from the perspective of the disciples. And the guru is guru only from the perspective of disciple. From the guru's point of view, the true guru, Bhagavan, in his view, I alone am. There's nothing other than me. So there are no problems anywhere. So it's only in our view that Bhagavan is guru. In his view, he alone exists. So Bhagavan was so claimed to be good. He didn't even, he never acknowledged that he was guru. Once Chadwick tried to pin Bhagavan down on this subject. One day he questioned Bhagavan. Bhagavan, you say that guru is absolutely necessary, is it not? Bhagavan said, yes, guru is absolutely necessary. But at the same time, you say that you are not guru. Bhagavan said, yes. Then am I wasting my time? I've come here all these thousands of miles. I've come to you, taking you to my guru, but you tell me the guru is necessary, but you are not guru. So what am I to do? Am I to go off and search for some other guru? He was trying to pin Bhagavan down, but Bhagavan was trying to explain to him, the guru is a guru only from the perspective of disciple. In the perspective of guru, there is neither guru nor disciple. But Chadwick was persisting, but he wanted Bhagavan to acknowledge that he was guru. So finally, Bhagavan said, jokingly, okay, someone go to the ashram office and take the ashram seal from the office, the seal that they put on the letters. So this is from Ramana Ashram. Get the official seal of the ashram and put that seal on him, if that will satisfy him. So indirectly, Bhagavan did acknowledge that, yes, he is guru. Of course, he is guru from our perspective, but not from his perspective. So Bhagavan was so humble in every way. I mean, Bhagavan, for example, Bhagavan never considered that it is his ashram or that he has any authority. He said, the ashram it's not my ashram. The ashram was started by the devotees for their own convenience. I just happen to be living here. If I don't obey the rules, I will have to leave. So I have to be very obedient. So he even sometimes when unreasonable rules were passed, he obeyed the rules explicitly. For example, once there was some towards the end of the building of a Atma-vichara temple, when some very important part of the construction process, and in so many stages they had to have special pujas and things. So there was, for some reason, to do with the building of a Atma-vichara temple, there was going to be some big puja. And because of that, there was going to be always in Ramana Ashram, whenever there's every day they do poor feeding in Ramana Ashram. And on days when there's any special event like Deepam or Bhagavan's Jayanti or Bhagavan's Aradhana or Shivaratri, any special event, they have on a special scale, on a larger scale, they have poor feeding. So on this day, there was this special puja, and there was also going to be special poor feeding. So many sadhus and others had come there, were waiting for their food. But the puja was taking a long time, so they were becoming impatient. So they were asking, when we're going to get our food, when we're going to get our food. Chinnaswami, who attached a lot of importance to the building of a temple for his mother, and wanted the puja to go on according to the letter, he got annoyed by these people getting impatient. So he came out and he shouted, "Paradises will be fed afterwards." Paradises means outsiders. Desam means place. Paradesam means foreigners, or those who are from outside. In other words, those who are not from the ashram, but are coming from outside just for the food. So he said, paradises will be fed afterwards. Unknown to him, this was overheard by Bhagavan. So after some time, the puja was finished and the dining hall bell went. Till then, and since then, every day, first the poor feeding is done, and then only food is served in the ashram. That was something that Bhagavan, though Bhagavan never assumed any position of authority, or gave any do's or don'ts, Bhagavan had his own way of indicating how he expected things to be done. And Bhagavan had very, very, in his own subtle way, he had clearly indicated poor feeding should be done first, then only feeding for others. That was Bhagavan's principle. And so the ashram always adhered to it. So on that day when Chinnaswami said paradises will be fed afterwards, he was actually going against what Bhagavan had clearly indicated was the proper way of doing things. So when the dining hall bell went, everyone queued up and went into the dining hall. But where was Bhagavan? Bhagavan didn't turn up. Bhagavan, you will usually queue up with everyone else and go into a dining hall with everyone else. But that day he didn't. So where's Bhagavan? So Chinnaswami is told Bhagavan is not anywhere. So they can't start feeding the people until Bhagavan comes. So they sent out a search party. Where is Bhagavan? He's not anymore. He doesn't seem to be anywhere in the ashram. Where is he? Eventually, they found Bhagavan was sitting under a tree in Palakottu. And they said, oh, Bhagavan, the dining hall bell went, has been rung, so everyone is waiting for you. And Bhagavan said, okay, yes, the dining hall bell has rung, you should all go and eat. And they said, but Bhagavan, we can't eat without you. No, you go and eat without me. It's not necessary for me to be there. So then they came back and reported this to Chinnaswami. And then Chinnaswami said, oh, why Bhagavan is not coming for food? Maybe he's not feeling well, someone suggested. So a couple of doctors were sent to go and inquire about Bhagavan's health. And Bhagavan said, no, I'm fine. There's nothing wrong. You all go and eat. Because the dining hall bell has rung, so you have to be punctual. You all have to go and eat. So they came back and reported this to Chinnaswami. And then he sent along a lawyer, thinking that a lawyer would have powers of persuasion to persuade Bhagavan to come. So this lawyer and one or two other people went to Bhagavan and tried to persuade him, but nobody can eat without you. And Bhagavan said, no, you all eat. It's not necessary. Then Bhagavan finally said, I am following Chinnaswami's instructions. Chinnaswami said, paradises will be fed only afterwards. I am a paradesi. So all of you who belong to the ashram, you all eat first. I will eat afterwards with the paradises because I'm only a paradesi. I don't belong here. So Bhagavan was so humble. He could have just, when he heard Chinnaswami passing that order, he could have overridden Chinnaswami's order. He didn't. Bhagavan will never do so directly. He will teach in a way but will never be forgotten. Never again after that did Chinnaswami ever dare to say paradises will be fed afterwards, because he knew what the consequences would be. So in this way, Bhagavan was so humble, even in his way of correcting people. And when people were going wrong, he would, in such a subtle and such a humble way, taking himself to be the lowest of the lowest, he will correct them. So Bhagavan exemplified perfect humility in his life, because Bhagavan is the humblest of all. Humility is the very nature of Bhagavan. That is why this sentence, to whatever extent sinking low we conduct ourselves, to that extent there is goodness. So sinking low means ego subsiding, being humble, being not rising, not oh, I am important, I am this, I am that, being the lowest of the low, seeing ourselves as whatever. We should always be willing to see some good, something in other people that is better than in ourselves. Once there was a person in the town who was known to be a pucker rogue. He was he was a bit of a he had earned money in an unrighteous way, and he had got he was involved in all sorts of dodgy activities. Everyone knew he was a very dodgy character and not at all a good person. And towards the end of his life, he all the money that he had earned by unrighteous means he lost, and he became very poor. And all people who had previously been running around at his beck and call, all his friends abandoned him. And eventually he passed away. When he passed away, some devotees came to tell this to Bhagavan, and they had an idea in their mind. Whenever someone passes away, Bhagavan will always say some good about them. But how can Bhagavan possibly say good about this fellow? He is such a rogue. Everyone knows he's a rogue. So how can Bhagavan, even Bhagavan will not be able to say something good about him? But when they came and they informed this news to Bhagavan, Bhagavan said, oh, he was such a person. Even when he was rich, he always wore the finest and best, the finest clothes, and he was always immaculately dressed. Even towards the end of his life, when he was suffering poverty and that he wasn't in good health, he was so particular about keeping his clothes so clean. He would come to the tank every day and he would wash his clothes meticulously, and he would dry them and make sure they were nicely dried and very neat and clean and tidy. Such a person, we can't see anyone like that who is so particular about his personal cleanliness. He's exemplary, Bhagavan said. So all those people who were expecting for Bhagavan wouldn't have anything good to say about him, Bhagavan has something good to say about even the worst of the worst. So such is the humility of Bhagavan, that he can see some good quality in even the worst of the worst people. What Bhagavan taught us by example, he teaches us in words in this sentence. Bhagavan expects us to live a life of total humility, of to be humbler than humble. We cannot be as humble as Bhagavan, but how can we be humble? The more we turn within and investigate ourselves, the more ego will subside and humility will become second nature to us. It will become second nature to us to the extent to which we subside by means of self-investigation and self-surrender. So this is a very, very important sentence. To whatever extent sinking low we conduct ourselves, to that extent, and that extent alone is their goodness. As I say, to whatever extent and to that extent, he says he says, to whatever extent, sinking low we conduct ourselves, to that extent, there is goodness, or it is good. So what is Bhagavan's idea of good? It's just to subside more and more and more. But the more we rise, the more all troubles come into existence. The more we subside, the more we are free of trouble. Therefore, he concludes this paragraph by saying, in the last sentence, maṉattai y-aḍakki-k-koṇḍirundāl. If one is restraining the mind, this particular formation, aḍakki means to restrain or to cause to subside. Koṇḍu means having. eṛundāl means being. But this particular sentence, this particular formation of an adverbial participle followed by koṇḍirundāl, it implies it gives a sense of continuity. So what it implies is if one is continuously restraining or curbing or subduing mind, in other words, if we're keeping the mind ever in a subsided condition, eṅgē irundālum irukkalām. Wherever one may be, one can be. That is, outward circumstances will affect us only to the extent to which we rise as ego. So if we curb the mind, if we don't allow ourselves to be swayed by our likes and dislikes and all our vasanas, if we keep the mind in a constant state, constantly curbed, constantly subsided by clinging to self-attentiveness, whatever may be our outward circumstances, wherever one may be, one can be. That is, the outward life will not affect us to the extent to which we curb we curb the rising of mind. We keep restraining the mind. We keep preventing the mind from rising. How do we prevent the mind from rising? Only by clinging to self-attentiveness. And the final word, irukkalām, means one can be. It can also mean let one be. So wherever one may be, let one be. So that is what Bhagavan is saying. Whatever be the circumstances, what should we do? We should just be. Irukkalām, let us just be. In this paragraph, Bhagavan is so much emphasizing the need for subsidence, subsiding. The more we subside, the more there is goodness. The more we subside, the less we will be affected by whatever may be the external circumstances of life. So whether we're in heaven or in hell, doesn't matter. We can be perfectly happy. We can be equally happy in hell as we can be in heaven if we keep our mind constantly subsided. If we don't rise as high, hell will be every bit as pleasant as heaven. We will not be affected by either condition because we have found the true heaven in our own heart by subsiding more and more within. So this is the essence of Bhagavan's teachings. Subsiding. All of Bhagavan's teachings are about subsiding. Subsiding is what is otherwise called surrender, and it is brought about only by holding more and more firmly to that fundamental awareness I am. So this is the very essence of Bhagavan's teachings. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Arunachala Ramanaya.